Dr. Bill Adams here, and this is No Spin Live special edition, really a part 3. We're here with our 3 international experts who have really provided incredible insights that we've gotten comments from all around the world on. And this episode should be called, Now We Have Some Data, but what are we going to do with it? So we're going to have a great discussion. I think you'll find many of the points that our experts will make quite compelling. So I want to start first just by introducing our group. I think most of you are well known, but we have Dr. Charles Randquist from Stockholm, Sweden, Dr. Tom Wiener from just south of me in Houston, Texas.
Howdy, folks.
And Dr. Dave Sieber from San Francisco, California. So guys, it's been another week now, a lot more information. I think there's quite a bit of experts now coming out talking about some of the things that we've touched on the past 2 weeks. But Charles, I'm going to start with you. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Swedish approach, which has been very different, and people are almost ridiculing you, for this approach. But now, not so much. And in fact, an article just came out that said the Swedish approach, what is Sweden doing right? So why don't you start with that and kind of share some thoughts with us?
Like I said from the beginning, I don't know if we're doing this right or wrong, but it feels very right for our society and our environment. And I want to be clear about this. We all live in different worlds, and obviously this is working quite well because Swedes pay taxes, we're disciplined, we listen to the government, we are pretty well educated and healthy, have a low BMI, less resistance against antibiotics. So in general, I think this is a concept that might work well in this type of country. Now, are we struggling? Absolutely, yes. We're struggling like all countries. And do healthcare staff work 24/7? Absolutely, yes. And are we starting to peak a little bit more? Yes. I mean, so far we have a little bit more than 300 deaths. But once again, those numbers are not telling us anything yet. Why? Because in order to know, we need to know what it's correlated to. And we don't have those numbers. We don't have any mass testing. We don't know if it's 10, 20, 30 times the amount that have had tested coronavirus that actually had the virus. So business is as usual. There are some more restrictions. We are now allowed to be 50 or less in groups. If you walk in Stockholm City, you'll see the streets are pretty empty, but people are walking outside. They're enjoying nature. They're taking the dog for a walk without having any penalties, or like I heard just today, the president of the Philippines saying if anyone is out on the street, you'll get shot. Or the videos that I'm seeing from India where people are getting beaten and where starvation is starting to set in because they can't work or make any money. So the situation is quite stable in Sweden. And for the reasons I just named, we are listening to our government. Now, whether our numbers will be less than the numbers in the rest of the world, we do not know. But our economy, I believe, won't suffer as much as other economies. Long-term concepts like depression, domestic violence, violence in general, probably won't get as high as for someone that is confined in quarantine for 1 or 2 or 3 months. So, long story short, I think the way we're doing this, the way we're fighting it, might not at the end give us less numbers of dead people in this disease, but maybe a healthier society in general.
And interesting, Charles, that the Swedish model, the other country that's doing something similar is Germany. And Germany has a somewhat similar model, and their mortality rate is dramatically less than other countries. Currently, actually, as of a few days ago, their mortality rate was 0.5%. Now, they're not saying that it's not spreading or anything like that, but the officials in Germany said that the reason that they feel it's that low is because they are having more widespread testing and earlier detection of outbreaks for better control. And I think that that's a real secret behind all of this. So there's a couple of things going on. Sweden and Germany both. Germany's, Germans are able to go out with certain limitations and interact. You can build that herd immunity because the virus is out there, but hopefully protect the more at-risk population. But the testing, like we've said in the previous two videos, two shows, the testing is crucial. And now there's two tests that we'll have to discuss shortly.
You're right. There are some differences. In Germany, you're not allowed to be more than two people, but you're allowed to go out. There is still some freedom. But the Germans are also very disciplined in this. So there are absolutely similarities. Until a couple of weeks, UK and Germany and Sweden had the same. Now Sweden are basically the only ones who are still allowing kids to go to school. But yes, you're right. But once again, like the Germans are saying themselves, we don't know why our numbers are lower than other countries. We don't know if the ones we are testing are the groups that might not have been affected or been affected. Maybe the disease has not yet hit the elder ones. And it's scary because beside Germany, there's France. And France today just hit the record, and I'm sorry using that word, but they had more than 1,500 deaths today. So they just peaked like this in one day. So nations, Europe is pretty small, and still we're seeing these big differences. But I think you'll see the same differences in the States. I mean, I think New York will be quite unique to a lot of other cities just because of the demography. I mean, the way the population live, the way the housing is, etc. So I think you'll see big differences in the States too.
The other thing that we talked about is antibody testing, because we don't know how many people are recovered, and we see these stats a lot about the number of people who are sick, the number of deaths. We're just now starting to see the recovery numbers for New York and some other states, but like we talked about before, there could be a large percentage of the population that already has an immunity to this, but we don't have any antibody tests to figure that out. And again, it goes back to the whole thing of having a lack of available data. And we don't really know what to do if we don't know what these numbers actually are.
The antibody test is now, it's available, but hasn't been mass produced, I don't think. So I think that's coming soon. Tom, actually, I had a question for you. There's a very lauded microbiologist named Dr. Sukarit Bhakti from Germany, who has a very well-known presentation. It was actually a letter to the Chancellor of Germany where he questions several things that are going on. One is the dangerousness of the virus, because there is some studies that show that the virus isn't really any more dangerous than any of the other 108 viruses that are out there. It's just a newly described virus. And he also questions the statistics. And so my question for you is, you kind of mentioned the surge, and then you hear about New York City, but you have to be very careful when you start throwing around numbers with this disease. For example, you hear the common figure, 5% of people that are infected need to go to the ICU. Dr. Bhakti makes the point that that's not 5% of the infected people, or the people that even test positive for this, because over half of those people we know aren't sick at all. They're asymptomatic. So it's really 5% of the people that are sick, which completely changes the numbers depending on what you argue. So can you speak just a little bit more about this so-called surge and asymptomatic infection and what we know from the data?
It's important, as you said, to define what your numbers are and what you're going to throw around, for instance, in the media. We all hear the surge, but the surge of what? And this is an important point. Currently, my feeling and what I've seen in the media, what I've read, is the surge that everyone is talking about is a surge in positive people. In other words, a surge in testing. Now, there is obviously, in certain circumstances, New York, New Orleans, there's a surge in hospitalized cases, but you also have to define what that surge is. But the issue, and this was predicted very early on, was that once testing for the virus became more available, we would have a surge of positive cases. Most of these people are not sick. Most are completely asymptomatic. Some have a flu-like illness, some have a cold. So you can't use a number that is not relevant to hospitalization to scare a population, to shut down an economy. What we have to look at is hospital utilization and obviously patient death and patient illness. These are the keys that we have to see. If we don't use the proper numbers and the numbers are from testing. So once again, as Charles and Dave said, the testing, there are two tests, one of which is the test for the virus. That tells if you're currently shedding virus. In other words, you're infected to other people. The other test is the antibody test. That one tells you if your body has produced antibodies and is fighting the virus. So in a little later, I'll get into what I think is going to be a tiered approach to how we let people, number one, get back to work, and number two, how healthcare workers treat certain sick patients.
But Tom, can you also just briefly just talk about New York City? Because I think people like to say, well, look at New York, it's terrible, which it is. And nobody is arguing that it's not. New York's been very hard hit. But if you look at what we know about the data of the virus and comorbidities and how it spreads, it's not really unpredictable that New York is having a tough time.
It's not unpredictable. And New York, and I'm going to actually throw in New Orleans too. And of course, I'll throw in the Diamond Princess. So as we've discussed in the previous videos, the Diamond Princess was a unique situation of what I'm going to call a mass gathering, which is a worst case scenario. The other worst case scenario, it was at an older population. Now, New York City, and to some degree, New Orleans, are cruise ships on land. And what we have is a densely packed population, oftentimes, at least for New York, an older population, and in some areas of New Orleans, an older population, a higher incidence of smoking, and we're going to discuss vaping a little while later because this is going to be an important key. New Orleans had the unfortunate timing of having Mardi Gras right before or just as this was starting. So very densely packed, and they're seeing the after effect of that. So and also much more recent studies have indicated that the two cities, and New Orleans in particular, the incidence of comorbid problems is very significant. New Orleans, the obesity rate is high, and also incidence of other comorbid problems. So we're looking at a situation where in New Orleans, of the patients who have died, 97% of the deaths in New Orleans had a pre-existing condition. Diabetes in 40%, obesity in 25%. Obesity is becoming a more significant risk factor for death with coronavirus than was previously anticipated. So these comorbid factors are a huge part of what we're seeing and where we're seeing them. The other issues that we'll get into later are the smoking and vaping and the lung damage, indications that the vaping is potentially worse than even the smoking. But also look at the cities. New York, New Orleans, more air pollution, and the potential for more chronic lung disease because of that. The interesting thing to follow over the next few weeks is the most polluted city for air pollution in the world, Mexico City. I predict a not good outcome there.
And Dave, I want to take it to you. Now, you're a scientist, as all of you all are scientists and have really made your careers on generating data and analyzing data and thinking about this. But again, people in general, what you see in the media, social media, is they talk about extremes. So for example, with this disease, we do know that some healthcare workers who are relatively healthy have died of this disease or gotten very sick. But you have to look at the data, and there's some very realistic and understandable reasons why that may be, and those are starting to come out in terms of this concept of viral load. I was hoping you could visit with this a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So if you look at the history of vaccinations, it's described a lot for smallpox and Montague. And what they would do is they had these specialists, almost kind of like a shaman or something, and they would take these people with smallpox and they would take the pustule and they would take some of the live virus from the pustule and then inoculate children and other people to elicit an immune response. And in the article that we read about, 1 out of every 100 had too much virus. And those people would have then end up getting full-on smallpox. The rest of the people would have a mild illness. They would elicit an immune response, they have antibodies, and then they would be totally immune. They couldn't get it again. And because COVID also is a single-stranded RNA virus, it's not mutating at all. Once we have immunity to this, it should be taken care of. Now, what's happening a lot in the hospital systems is, we talked about this earlier, is you have these nanoparticles and microparticles. So if you have 40 people, let's say, in an ICU, some of them are on ventilators or even just a regular step-down unit where they're breathing, they're coughing, you have particles basically floating around everywhere. And if you take a healthy 30 or 40-year-old healthcare worker, which we've seen occasionally get very, very sick from this, it's most likely happening because of the viral load. They're having a huge intake of this live virus, and because that load is so high, their immune system is unable to elicit an immune response fast enough, because the virus basically is taking over some of the mechanics of the cellular replication, and it's stopping the immune response from happening. And because of this huge load up front, these people end up getting very, very sick. In addition to that, the viral load also is causing things like these cytokine storms. It's causing these hypercoagulable states. So when these huge viral loads get into people, it's causing way more problems than people who are walking down the street and might have someone who's infected cough, and they might take in a very small amount of the live virus. Those people oftentimes are these asymptomatic carriers like Tom was talking about, or people who end up with a very mild form of COVID, of the coronavirus, and then end up making a full recovery. So a lot of these factors are just now kind of coming out that we're understanding better, but I think viral load it plays a huge part in how sick a lot of these people are getting.
What's interesting, what you're saying is, like I said in the first program, already 100 years ago during the Spanish flu, data showed that those ones who were treated outside in tents, they didn't die as much as those ones who were treated indoors. Staff who were treating these patients outdoors in tents didn't get as sick as those ones who were treating these patients indoors. So already 100 years ago, they were aware of that fresh air and draft would actually assist. And you're bringing up something very, very important that hasn't been discussed so much. It's the nano and the micro droplets. We're told we should keep a social distance of 1.5 to 2 meters, because when you cough, that's where they land. But the thing with nano and with micro droplets, they become part of the aerosol, and depending on the environment, they will float around. So you could just imagine what happens when you're confined in an area with a lot of people, the way you were saying it. And this is something that I think people are getting more and more aware of. So countries like, for instance, South Korea or Taiwan, where people are used to wearing masks, not coughing out like this in their arm and also keeping a social distance, I think have been more protected. And what we see right now is probably a consequence of putting people in quarantine, confining them in small apartments with a lot of different ages. And those ones who are not that strong with underlying diseases, like Tom said, including obesity, which hasn't been addressed enough, of course will suffer more in that environment. And that's probably one of the reasons why Sweden, although probably that's also changing slightly, why Sweden has been better is because approximately 50% of our population are living in one or as one or two people in the apartments or in their villas. So it's easier to keep distance in our environment. But once they get into the hospitals, once they start getting into that environment and the healthcare people start working in an environment with a lot of people, of course, the chances of getting sick is extremely high.
I mean, the other thing is I think it's almost helpful to expose people to these nanoparticles because, and we've talked about this before with herd immunity, that these particles are basically acting almost as a rudimentary vaccine, because if you can expose someone to enough of these particles to elicit an immune response where you're going to make an abundance of antibodies, then it's over.
And expose them to a low dose, such as what they get in normal daily activities. Now, obviously, you still want to avoid mass crowds. You know, you don't want to have 100 people in a church all packed together, but
right.
In normal daily activities, because the church altogether, that's a high dose. That's the excessive dose, and they get sicker. Just like you were saying, that's what that data shows. If you give them low dose exposure, they develop antibodies without having they may get some illness, but they won't get the extreme illness, assuming that they're not a high risk group.
Being able to detect who is immune and who's not immune, who are we going to send to the elder ones and who are we going to have working in hospitals? Because one of the things that was also learned by the First World War was that when the Spanish flu, was that a lot of the people who got affected and died were also those ones who were malnutrition due to the war itself. So having hospital staff working 48/7, I'm exaggerating here, day and night, of course will create a big fatigue. And on top of that, a great load of virus will of course create an environment which is not that healthy. And I think we'll see a lot of healthcare people getting affected more than other work groups that are out there in the society.
I think that's really interesting. And so you can talk about malnourished patients or in the Spanish flu or fatigued people being at more risk. And Tom, that is exactly what the data is saying now, that comorbidities are huge when it comes to risk for this. So, obviously the vast majority of people that are dying from this are older patients. So there's no doubt about that, but there are some younger patients. So talk a little bit about comorbidities and the significance of those in this epidemic.
Well, the figures I talked about earlier about New York and New Orleans are actually very telling. There's a couple of reports, and of course this data could easily be obtained, showing that, just to put it in a simple way, people in New Orleans are sicker than people in New York, and obesity rate is higher. So this figure is really very dramatic. In a report on April 2nd, this is recent, the coronavirus death rates in New Orleans were twice as high as in New York City, twice as high. And once again, those figures of 97% of the deaths in New Orleans had a pre-existing condition, which we know is going to be true. The pre-existing conditions are a multitude of factors. As I mentioned, obesity is a significant part of it. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, lung disease, but also we have to start getting into the habit of accepting the fact that just being a smoker and just being a vapor should be considered a comorbidity for this disease. And that's even true of the flu, because the death rates and the hospitalization rates and the pneumonia rates for someone who smoked with the flu are higher. That's just common sense, but it's also in the data because we know more of the data of the flu. So the issues are that there's a paper that has shown that vaping may actually cause, because of the certain chemicals in the vaping products, may actually cause more inflammation of the lungs, and this sets up a scenario where the virus can just go wild and the conversion to pneumonia is higher. That's why we're seeing, you've seen the reports of part of this so-called surge are these younger patients being, 20s, 30s, being admitted to the hospital, being more ill with no apparent pre-existing conditions, except they're not counting smoking and especially vaping. That's the one that's escaping a lot of the data. So these patients actually do have a pre-existing condition. They have a comorbid condition, that's vaping. And that's why we're seeing some of these younger patients. Of course, now they're in them being admitted, they're not going to die at the same rate as someone who is elderly or has diabetes. And, they're going to do better, but they're still utilizing hospital resources for sicker patients who need them.
I mean, it wasn't even that long ago, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, a lot of these states basically banned vaping. San Francisco basically banned it because these young people were being hospitalized on ventilators, dying from vaping because of the irreversible lung damage. And then also, we talked about this earlier, but there's a lot of good data to show that any of these smoking, vaping, prolonged hypertension, cardiovascular disease, a lot of these things cause an upregulation of these ACE2 receptors that are in the lung. And as we've discussed, that's where the virus really gets in. That's its entry point into the lung tissue. So you have these patients now with these conditions who have already set them up to get the pneumonia. Because once you have that pneumonia, I think that's when people really get into trouble.
Yep. These comorbidities that you all are talking about is also an environmental factor. So for example, Italy's had a bad issue with this, but there's a number of reasons why that is, including things like a lot of multi-generational housing where there's mixing between grandparents, parents, and children, but also pollution. So Northern Italy has a significant issue with air quality and pollution. In fact, it is estimated that the air pollution causes about 8,000 deaths a year in Northern Italy. So there's a lot of factors, including just the environment, that are factoring in this. Charles, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was about to say that so far we know that the coronavirus affects the respiratory system more than most other viruses. And we've pointed out that the risk groups are really elderly people, and then people who are obese, have respiratory diseases, smokers. But I want to point out a third group that's definitely a risk group, and that's healthcare staff that are affected with a much higher dose of virus. So we have three groups. And I think what we'll see is, we'll see the first wave of these sick people coming into the hospitals, and then we'll see the second wave of affected healthcare people getting affected, all those ones treating these ones. And that's where I see a big dilemma when this hits the peak, that we won't have staff who are able to take care of the sick because they themselves are sick. And a lot of reasons for this is because we haven't been made aware of, or we are not aware of, that having protection is very important. And looking at what they did in China and the way they were protecting ourselves, and what I've seen how people take care of patients in Europe where there's a lack of this clothing, it's like they are so far ahead of us in their thinking than a lot of countries and hospitals have been doing in Europe. And it's not because we don't have the knowledge, it's just a lack of equipment or not being prepared. So I see three different groups. But there's something else I'd like to bring up, which I brought up last time, which I think is as important. we are aware of that the virus will kill. But I don't see the virus as a big problem. I see the consequences of our actions, our fear, as a much bigger problem. And you know, it's surprising. We've had the moral debate in question about lockdown or no lockdown, and we've been talking about lives versus lives or lives versus economy. I think it's no more. The discussion is not any longer about lives or economy. It's about science and evidence medicine and democracy and the violence against individuals as the societies associated previously with totalitarian states, the way their actions, we are actually doing this in our democracies. We have a situation where good people are getting harassed, beaten, penalized because they're walking out with their dogs and their pets. And we're accepting advanced surveillance techniques and they're launched without being questioned in the name of saving lives. And the right of integrity is actually removed in the interest of better good. So I believe that, yes, this is scary, but once you remove something that has been called freedom, it's very difficult to get it back. And it's important for us to question the consequences of a lockdown of 1/3 of the world population, which is actually going on right now. And we cannot let hysteria and social media prevail over science. I think it's extremely important that we bring this philosophic discussion up and ask ourselves, whose lives are we saving and what are the costs long term? That there will be a financial a crisis and sort of a depression, we are aware of that. But I think even worse, how will people react once they realize that there has been a lockdown and maybe the numbers that have been told to them to give them fear and make them feel that it's right to stay indoors are not right, and they come out in the reality, brutal reality? How will they trust their governments and democracy?
Well, Charles,
Well,
I think
funny.
you're not alone in that opinion. In fact, Dr. Bhakti, who we talked about earlier, he points that out in his letter and his video that was submitted, that the virus is not any more dangerous than other viruses, and the data proves that. But the economic consequences, as you're talking about, are significant. There's a Nobel laureate from Stanford University that shares the exact same opinion that you just shared. I think it's very important, and I'd like to get Tom and then Dave's comments on this subject. So, Tom, what are your thoughts?
Well, just like Charles said, I think that's very true, especially in a situation where the methods being enacted have no proof for working. What's happening right now is a more global type lockdown. In other words, we're locking down everyone. Okay, that may not be right. As a matter of fact, let's see, in late March, Governor Cuomo was at a conference, or he was doing something, and he said, this is a quote, this is from his mouth, he said that the stay-at-home order for all was probably not the best strategy. The young and viral shedding were locked away with the older and at risk. And he said, this is a quote, having a public health strategy with a back-to-work strategy would probably have been the best thing. So, as we lose these freedoms, as Charles said, it's going to be very difficult to get them back. But in particular, as Charles implied, when the strategies are not necessarily the best strategies, both for life and for economy. So, and this will get into something we'll probably expand on in a few minutes. What should we be doing? Should we be doing a lockdown of the entire population, or should we be doing an isolation of the at-risk population and then let the healthier or lesser risk population get back to work, get back to school? Now, the other qualifier to all of this is viral testing and antibody testing will make this significantly easier. So that's going to be a key. And I think more importantly than anything we've discussed, the one qualifier to everything that we say, everything that we do for this show, everything that you see in the media, is that all of this is dependent on the fact that a vaccine has not yet been developed. That's why we're in a crisis. So when the vaccine gets developed, I predict that this virus is going to be shown to be a very weak virus, and that it's going to go away. It's going to be a mild seasonal flu. But we have to get to that point, and in getting to that point, the big factor in vaccine production, it's not really coming up with the vaccine. There's been many companies so far that have come up with the vaccine, very importantly. However, it's the human testing that slows the process down. So they can come out with a vaccine in a few weeks. The testing may take a year. The critical element for this situation and for every situation in the future is that there are going to have to be compromises to clinical testing. There's going to have to be a situation where an emergency, a pandemic such as this, is going to have a specific sequence to shortening the clinical testing and getting the vaccine out, even if it's not a perfect vaccine, even if there's potential problems like not as effective as some others, we may have to change the vaccine, but a vaccine will have to come out far sooner to stop the excessive deaths, or at least to stop the excessive hysteria.
And just remind us, so there's 60,000 deaths worldwide due to COVID. How many people died worldwide of flu this year?
The flu deaths worldwide were huge. It was 670,000. I believe was the number.
But why didn't we hear about that? Why did we not hear about that?
That's an interesting thing. And as we sort of pointed out in one of the previous shows, it's a seasonal flu. We've been acclimated mentally to the seasonal flu. The media has been acclimated mentally to the seasonal flu. We don't care about it. That's why when this virus came on board in the United States in Washington State, as Dave said in one of the previous shows, that was probably not the first time this occurred. I was describing a situation before the show started today that a friend of mine had the flu a number of weeks ago, kind of at the starting point of all of this in the U.S. And that person was ill. She tested negative for the flu, and she called her physician, and her physician said there were a surprising number of flu cases in Houston that were testing negative for the flu. Now, that obviously brings up the point. Was that just a missed flu as far as the test, or was that the coronavirus already running through the population and being blended in to the seasonal flu? The seasonal flu, unfortunately, the definition of a pandemic, by definition, no longer includes the seasonal flu, because, and this is from their definitions, the researchers, the higher ups definitions, because it occurs every year. There are so many deaths yearly in the U.S. and worldwide that are overshadowing this issue of coronavirus. And we already discussed the utilization in the hospitals when we put the deaths or the illnesses of the coronavirus on top of a situation where the flu has already come close to maxing out the hospital utilization.
So flu outpaced COVID by an order of magnitude. Dave, I'm going to go to you. So we have accumulating science on this. Clearly, you talked about earlier, herd immunity, asymptomatic infection. We know that occurs. We know it's probably at least 50% of the infections are asymptomatic. But you were the first person to be in a shelter in place and lockdown. And Charles alluded to how over a third of the world is basically in isolation. Is this the right approach? I mean, am I where I live in Dallas County, they just announced they're going to extend the shelter in place to May 20th. What are we doing? Is that the right approach?
I don't think it is. I think Sweden really took on the correct approach with this. And I think what they're doing is isolating the at-risk people and then letting the young, healthy people go about, kind of business as usual with some more restrictions and rules. Because if you look at the young people who are being affected by this, it's not the young people who are going out and going to the hardware store, or someone who works in an IT job or a desk job somewhere. I mean, the young people, like we discussed already, the young people who are really getting hit hard by this are the healthcare workers who are exposed to this really high viral load. And I think at this point, we kind of know who is at risk and who's going to get really sick from this. And I think there's some merit to being extra careful to isolate these people. Tom was saying earlier about a strategy. What's our economic strategy? Unfortunately, we don't have one. In the U.S., we have this $2.2 or $2.3 trillion CARES Act that was released to basically give a bunch of people money. But that's not really a strategy to help the economy recover. And I'm curious to see what's going to happen, especially with our plastic surgery practices, once these shelter in places are lifted. What's going to happen? Are people just going to go back to business as usual? I'm sure the same thing with all of your practices. I have like 2 months of patients who are backlogged now, who are supposed to have surgery, who are now all getting moved forward, and we keep moving them. Luckily, people are understanding about the situation, but I just don't know how we're gonna hop right back into this. Or, I've been talking to my banker a lot and some other friends who are, know a lot about economics, and their feeling is that this is gonna drag on for quite some time before we're actually able to rebound from it.
Absolutely. And 98%, at least in the United States, 98% of businesses are small businesses. And when they're shut down, the effects of that are far reaching in the United States for sure. And I'm sure around the world that there's some similarities. So, well, I want to get some concluding remarks from each of you. Charles, we've talked about a lot of things, but what do you feel the way forward is?
Before I say anything about that, I think we need to acknowledge that this is not a regular flu. It is a more aggressive virus. All the studies we've seen so far, a regular flu normally has a factor of 1.3. This has a more aggressive factor. And that's probably why there has been these dramatic lockdowns in order to avoid a spike for people, for a big amount of people getting affected in a short period.
You're talking about contagiousness, Charles, right?
Yes,
Yes, I think that's right. But the question is it more dangerous? It's more contagious, but is it more dangerous? So the thing is, like Dr. Bachke says,
I want to go on to that. So I think that's the reason why. So once again, it brings us back to the thing. Okay, so it's more aggressive. We do these lockdowns, but will we save more lives by doing that? That's the big question. And if we decide to do the lockdowns, where are we going to put in quarantine? All the population or those ones who normally get a flu vaccine, which are the risk groups. Right now, personally, I feel the way it's being done is that we're just bringing in a third group, which are the healthcare people, into this equation, which will be affected. So we need to acknowledge it is more contagious. It's a little bit more aggressive. But at the end of the day, will it kill more people? I doubt that. But that's a different topic, and future will tell. Where will we go on from this? Well, during the Depression, around 1/3 of the population were unemployed. Actually, a little bit less, I think, but around 1/3. 2008, around 10%. The crisis, 81, 82, around 10%. The way the numbers look now, what's happening is that we'll surpass that. And how far will depend on how aggressive countries will be with these lockdowns, which is, like we've said before, all of us, it's not evidence-based medicine. So from here on, I don't think our problem in Europe will be the big ones. We'll have issues. I fear what will happen in the States. Why? Because the United States is like the big engine, the big economy. But on top of that, what I really fear is what's going to happen in the third world or semi-third world. and the disasters we might see there with starvation, etc. So I'm as a citizen of the world, I'm more scared of the future we're giving to our kids based on something that's a big experiment. It's really a big experiment. We don't have all the right answers, but what we're doing right now, shutting down businesses, families, lives in this way, that's where my concern is. It's not the virus. Now, like you said, last year probably 600,000 died. 2 years before that, when we had a big flu, there were approximately 800 to 1 million. Every year, there are hundreds of thousands dying of the malaria or things like that. And here we're killing the economy and not questioning it. And on top of that, what I alluded on and what we'll probably talk more about in the future, democracy itself, trust in governments, trust in the economic system. It's not the wealthy ones that will suffer. The wealthy ones will always survive. The big businesses will always survive. The ones who are most in debt to banks will always get loans. It's the poor ones. It's the average, the middle class that's going to suffer. And I think definitely there will be a lot of questions in the societies, and I won't be surprised once this hits bigger communities, like was said before, Mexico City, Lagos, Nigeria, Cairo, Egypt, hits these. I won't be surprised if there will be masses standing up asking what's going on, even riots. And that brings fear into me.
No doubt. Tom, what's the way forward?
Well, me being a shy, unopinionated person, as I am, that I'm just going to say it outright. What is going on, what is being recommended now in the United States by the so-called experts is wrong. We're not heading in the right direction. We need to make a dramatic shift right now, not just for the coronavirus, but for any novel virus that comes about in the future, because there will be others. Now, once again, everything we're talking about, everything I'm going to say in the next minute or so, maybe 2 minutes, is going to be based on the fact that we don't currently have a vaccine. Okay, so that's an important point, and also a treatment. For instance, the flu. We have a vaccine that covers a fairly significant portion of the strains. We also have medications like Tamiflu. Now, there's some being developed and some very dramatic responses in some of these. Remdesivir, an antiviral. There's also the chloroquine and the hydroxychloroquine, along with the antibiotic. The Z-Pack that are showing some significant improvements. But as far as what is the plan that we should do, we need to base this on two factors, one of which is, or two groups, one of which is the public as a group, and the other is our healthcare workers. And these are two separate groups that we need to address and identify. I think that this is clear that this virus is a virus of mass gathering. So I think it is correct that part of the plan is right. No mass gatherings, no sports, no packed bars. Churches are going to have to find a different way to worship. It doesn't say in the Bible, please go ahead and put yourself at the highest risk for no particular reason and die. That's not what the Bible says. Do it smartly. Okay. So what we do, for the public, it's not isolation of the entire populace. It's as Dave and also as Charles has said, and also as we've seen in Sweden and in Germany, isolation of the high-risk patients. It's definition of the high-risk patient that's critical. The elderly is obvious. That's a huge key. The others are people with pre-existing conditions, including diabetes, chronic lung disease, including asthma in younger patients. Younger people. That's why some of these younger people are getting sick. No, asthma is not an insignificant number in the younger population. Heart disease, obesity, and then of course we know the issues now of smokers and vapors. So those are the ones that are potentially going to have to be isolated, even if they are young. Let the children go back to school, especially the young children, the ones that are almost completely asymptomatic. Very rare illness and death in the grade school age for patients. Use common sense, as Charles has said many times. The greater discipline in Sweden of hand washing, not touching your face and mouth. Keeping children away from high-risk populations. Now, for healthcare workers, this is a different story. If a healthcare worker is sick or tests positive for the virus and negative for in other words, they're currently shedding virus, they need to go home. Okay. If they were previously positive for the virus and now negative, and with the antibody test they're positive, which means they are immune. Those are the healthcare workers who can take care of the higher risk patients in the hospital. The ICU patients, the patients that need to be intubated, the ones that are generating this aerosol virus. That's a real key for decreasing the situation of healthcare workers getting sick. In those patients or those healthcare workers where they test negative for the virus and the antibody, obviously they need to be taking care of the less ill patients, and also if they're going to have to take care of some less ill coronavirus patients, they need to be wearing the full gear, the N95 masks, the face shields, the garments, everything else like that, to protect themselves until a vaccine is developed. For healthcare workers with coexisting conditions, obesity, smoking, vaping, diabetes, then they care for non-COVID patients, non-coronavirus patients. But once again, the whole key here is development of a vaccine, and that has to be streamlined. I think more than anything else I say today, the government, the United States, the world are going to have to streamline development of a vaccine past the patient testing, the clinical testing, and get it out to the public ASAP.
But that's going to take time. Meanwhile, we have to open the windows and let draft go through, because I think absolutely what old people told us when we were younger, fresh air is never bad.
Right.
Yeah, maybe not just like the glass of orange juice a day or something, but the opening the windows thing, that was actually, Grandma was right about that one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave, all right. So what's your you got the final word?
I mean, so I agree with everything that's been said. Something that we had talked about previously was that there's always been coronaviruses in the regular mix every year. And I think we talked about in one of the other shows that 7 to 14% of the people with flu actually have a form of the coronavirus. So even though we're treating this as something novel, it is to a degree, but it's not that novel. I do think that the virus is way more contagious because of those nanoparticles and microparticles we talked about. The other thing is, because of all these asymptomatic carriers, I think there's a lot of people who have the virus and are shedding the virus, walking around not knowing. And that's why I think having a lot of this testing is so important. Once we can test for immunity as well as people who are actually sick. Another thing we didn't talk about was isolation of hospitals. And this is in an article we read about. Basically, the way that everything's set up now is let's say New York has 5 hospitals. They have COVID patients in every single hospital. And now what happens is you're taking one of these COVID patients, they're going into the hospital, and they're basically infecting the hospital. So they're infecting other patients, they're infecting the healthcare workers, and then that's just propagating spread. What they did in Wuhan is they basically set up these tents for sick people, and they would go, that's where they'd live. In New York, they brought in the Naval Hospital there, but what's going to happen with that is they're going to put healthy people in there as well as sick people, and then you're going to be propagating this whole disease again. I agree with what Tom said. I think that in times like this, the government needs to I don't want to say cut corners, but they need to basically streamline the process of getting these vaccinations done. I mean, if you look at the United States compared to Europe or other countries, it's so much easier to get medications approved in these other countries. The FDA is so highly regulated that it's almost impossible to get things through in a timely fashion. And I think there needs to be some sort of executive order that in times like this, where there is a pandemic, where we can really streamline these vaccinations, we can kind of fast track a lot of the human trials to get it out there. Worst case scenario with these vaccines, if you look at the history of vaccines, is you might over vaccinate someone and give them kind of a more severe form of the illness. But it's something that we really have to do in order to keep this process moving forward.
Yeah, I think those are some great thoughts. And the antibody test, I think, is a game changer. It's something that's going to, it needs to be mass produced, and it needs to be, we need a random sampling of the population so we really know what's going on, even more than that we know now. It would be great to even do that with some of the healthcare workers to start with, because that also, as you've talked about, gives us some insights into strategies how to best care for some of these patients. The only thing I would add, I would like to see the government officials, particularly the ones in the United States, to actually look to these experts that are talking about data, just as this group is, but there's been others that we've talked about that are providing information. They really need to look at that in trying to come up with policy, because I really do fear that we're going down a path that's not evidence or science-based, and that's not going to lead us to where we want to go. So it's been great. I appreciate you guys' time and insights, and this won't be the last time we'll be here. I'm sure we'll be back next week. And if you want to see more of this, you can see it on the plasticsurgerychannel.com.